Second.
Ready? All right, everybody, welcome to our evening of Just War in America conversation with two distinguished scholars sharing their brand new book, a copy of which I don't even have yet, but they have promised one to me later this evening after we have completed our work here, so I'm looking forward to it. Our evening, of course, is hosted by Institute of Religion and Democracy, of which I'm the president. So my name is Mark Tooley, and thank you for the standing ovation. And we also publish Providence, a journal of Christianity, American foreign policy, and Just War teaching is a central part of the focus for that journal. And we have some extra copies if you'd like to take one home with you and commend it to you in terms of you being a potential subscriber. I won't share the full biographies of our speakers because you can easily look it up yourself, but Mark comes to us all the way from the West Coast at Fox University and is a prolific author, having just had 3 books come out in the last 6 months?
This year.
So it's been extremely busy. He's especially accomplished in terms of early American history and the role of religion in early American history. And our other speaker, Daryl Charles, also very, very accomplished. And one of his chief accomplishments is being a contributing editor to Providence, for which we're very grateful. But he is one of America's leading Just War scholars. So this is the perfect team to come together to examine America's wars through the lens of Just War teaching. So they're going to speak to us for about 40 minutes, I assume alternating as a tag team, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions and comments afterwards. So Mark, would you like to begin first? So appreciate you being with us.
Thank you, Mark. Well, thank you all for coming out on a busy night. I'm sure you have plenty of other things you could be doing. Mark, thank you very much for having IRD host us. It's a wonderful organization you have here. So this volume was birthed out of a concern that both Daryl and I had. There's a lot of literature on the Just War tradition, written by philosophers and theologians, and it's very abstract. And occasionally, these philosophers and theologians will reach down into history for an example, but they don't necessarily do hard historical work. They don't necessarily understand the example well. On the other hand, you have historians doing great work, military historians especially, on various conflicts. And yet historians, getting them to make moral judgments about the past is like pulling teeth. They just think it's completely inappropriate. And so we thought a useful exercise might be to bring together a group of scholars that accept and understand the validity of the Just War tradition, and yet are also experts in a particular era or conflict, and have a volume with roughly 12 chapters looking at each of America's major conflicts from a Just War perspective, and actually requiring them to evaluate, did America enter into this war justly? Did it fight this war justly? And to the extent to which it makes sense to ask the question, did it bring about a just peace after the conflict? And so we, first of all, we had to figure out what conflicts to cover. Unfortunately, America has been in, by some counts, by Harry Stout's count, 300 military conflicts, some bigger than others, of course. And so we decided we just had to limit it to the bigger conflicts, beginning with the War for American Independence, going through all the usual suspects, War of 1812, Mexican-American War, World War I, World War II, and then ending with chapters on the 2 Gulf Wars in Afghanistan and the War on Terror. And what we'll do here is I'm just going to provide a sort of brief introduction to the volume, turn it over to Daryl, he'll say a few words. I'll maybe come back, and I think I will, if I have time, to speak about the War for American Independence, because it kind of raises a fun and difficult issue, and it also makes an important point. So Daryl and I recruited an excellent scholar, a senior military officer at the U.S. Air Force Academy, but also a historian with a PhD in history who's a good historian. And he wrote a nice chapter arguing that the War for American Independence is unjust. We should not have fought this war. Now, I just happen to think he's wrong. I understand his arguments, they're plausible arguments, but I think they're wrong. So I'll actually maybe use this as an opportunity to offer rebuttal but it also makes a point. People of goodwill can disagree about these sorts of complicated questions. There's maybe one or two wars that I think are pretty obviously, in one case unjust, in another case just. But otherwise, there's some real serious moral work to be done here. And so we invite you all into this conversation. It's not about us telling you what the tradition requires and how it was properly applied here, there, or the other place. Now, the one problem with this volume is that you might get the sense that just war is about justifying wars. I gotta say, Daryl comes from the Mennonite background. I come from a Quaker background. I teach at a Quaker school. We hate war. We do not like war. We do not want to justify war. In fact, what the just war tradition is about is preventing wars and ameliorating the violence of wars when they must be fought. The chapter I wanted to write for the volume was initially called Wars America Did Not Fight. And this is a real success of the tradition. Let me just give you one example. So in the mid-19th century, the United States of America and Great Britain came very close to war on multiple occasions over the Canadian U.S. boundary. All right? So beginning from the burning of the American ship the Caroline by Canadian soldiers in 1837. This includes a so-called Aroostook War. Now here you did have Canadians or British soldiers and American soldiers shooting at each other under what is now the Maine-New Brunswick border, but fortunately cooler heads prevail. Military forces were called off, and we negotiated a settlement. Diplomats got together and negotiated the New Brunswick Maine border, but people are slow to learn. And so as we progress out west, America and Great Britain again argued over what would be the Canadian Pacific Northwest United States border, right? And you had American hotheads who were absolutely insistent on 54-40 or fight, which would have pushed the American border way up into what is now known as Canada. On the other hand, Great Britain pretty much wanted Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. And again, tensions were high, cooler heads prevailed, a settlement was reached. Now, we aren't naive enough to say it's just because these were good just war thinkers who got together and applied the just war tradition, but we would like to think that this is a tradition that has had a great deal of influence in the West. It has influenced and our political leaders and military leaders talk using this terminology, and hopefully it encouraged people to say, look, we will not go to war unless we absolutely have to, because it's a very serious endeavor and it will require a just cause, a just intent, and so forth and so on. So with that, by way of introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Daryl, and he will talk to you for 15 minutes or so, turn it back to me. I'll say a few words about the War for American Independence, and then we'll turn it over to you. So Daryl, please.
Thank you, Mark. Is one of these seats hot? I think I like that better. Well, thanks to Mark Tooley and IRD for the kind invitation to be with you here tonight, this evening, and to talk a little bit about a book. And what a delight just to meet friends of IRD. I began hearing about the Institute on Religion and Democracy back in the early 90s. I was doing public policy work here in the metro area and working with Charles Colson in Prison Fellowship, and was doing the unbearable, having to commute from Maryland down to the metro. It was that, I still hate that northwest quadrant of 495. As you can tell, I haven't been healed of that. I'm still scarred from the experience. And yesterday, as I was driving from Germantown down to Arlington, I relived some of those unpleasant memories. But that's not why I'm here to talk to you this evening. And anyway, yeah, and we were particularly excited when several years ago, through the vision of IRD, the journal Providence was birthed and was published, and we're really excited about that. That has a niche, and it's unique in many ways. Mark and I are excited about the particular volume that we are presenting to you. We know nothing quite like it, and perhaps I need to qualify what seems like a very brash statement. Yes, there's a lot of literature out there on individual wars, is there not? Yeah, there is a lot of critique, historical analysis of individual American wars. We know, however, of no volume that actually takes aggregately the major wars and conflicts in the history of our nation and evaluates them through the prism of the just war tradition and its moral wisdom. And so we're excited about it for that very reason. The volume was crafted under certain basic assumptions, and I thought for a minute or two I would simply lay out those before you and identify them. First, we see that there's a need in evaluating particular wars by, and I heard that in Mark's comments, to wed serious historical analysis with serious moral analysis. It might seem like an overgeneralization, but very often the two are not found in perhaps the same critique or same account of a war of America. And so that's important. Second, reflection on the past, do you agree with me, can inform the present and the future. That is to say, there are important lessons that we glean for today and for tomorrow because of what we learned from the past. Sounds so reasonable, doesn't it? But we live in a day of secular fundamentalism, postmodern nihilism, and so the past really doesn't mean that much to us as a culture. Now, I'm overgeneralizing here to make a point, I think. But that's tragic. So we have to fight, that is to say, citizens have to fight to retain memory of the past and to learn from it. There are valuable lessons from the past, are there not? And you don't even have to be a parent to appreciate that. Some of those lessons are valuable, and very often those lessons entail sacrifice. Now, not all sacrifice is honorable, some is meaningless, but some sacrifice is necessary, and some is honorable. And there's a beauty in sacrifice where the virtues of justice and charity, that is neighbor love, are wed for the sake of protecting others. Justice, let's define that, at least classically, rendering to others what is their due, right? And from the Christian perspective, rendering to others what is due based on their inherent dignity. Yes, charity, just think the golden rule, rendering to others as you would want to render to you. Can we say that? Now I'm going to identify a negative corollary to that positive. Do not render to others what you would not want rendered to you. And I'm going to even take another step and identify a third corollary, which would speak maybe to the morality of humanitarian intervention or interventionary force. And that is, do not allow to be done to others or other people groups what you would not want done to yourself. We might want to discuss that in our, what hopefully will be a very rich question and answer time. Third assumption that we made in putting this volume together, our connection to tradition is important. You're going to hear this word in the next couple of minutes quite a bit, and if you read the book, you will. And we speak intentionally of a tradition of just war as opposed to just war theory. And unfortunately, there is a tendency, if you look at the literature, and for example, since 2003, the literature has just exploded, and for obvious reasons, because of what we're involved in over the last 18, 17 years. Theory and tradition, if we can do a little bit of grammatical parsing, are very different. Tradition from traditio, right? Passing on, handing on, right? So for example, we speak, those of us who are confessionally Christians speak of an historic Christian tradition, don't we? Didn't fall out of nowhere, didn't come yesterday, wasn't invented by Methodists, as much as we appreciate them, right? Or Catholics, or Presbyterians, yes. So, there's wisdom in tradition. Well, guess what? We live in a very anti-traditional era, do we not? People are loath. And that's a challenge. I'm a university professor by training. That's a challenge to get my students today to appreciate tradition generally. Now, it's an overstatement. I know many of them are valuing tradition, but generally there is this attitude toward, and it's affected by the culture, a sort of opposition to tradition. Tradition is anchored in what's enduring. See, what's abiding. And it's important to be linked to that. So this idea of justified, and I'll use that term rather than just war, justified, that is, interventionary force must always be justified morally. Doesn't mean that we always have, and the issue is not, has America been pristine? No. It's whether the tradition provides the moral wisdom for us to look to. I want to argue, Mark and I want to argue through the book, and hopefully the Christian community, and hopefully citizens, as well as military analysts, as well as politicians, as well as policy analysts, will argue that there's wisdom in that tradition if we rediscover it. Fourth assumption behind the book, and I just stated it, and I'll say it with different words. Politicians, policy analysts, military strategists, and yes, the wider citizenry, that is all on the spectrum of civil life and civic life, need acquaintance or reacquaintance with the tradition. It's stunning to me how ignorant the average this sounds like a criticism, it's not meant to be, it's an observation. But to me it's stunning how ignorant the average layperson is of this tradition of justified war, which seeks not to bless what we want to do anyway, no, but rather severely qualifies whether or not we should apply coercive force. And then how we go about doing that. And then, post-conflict, post-use of an interventionary force, what do we do? What does justice demand of us now to help, yes, reconstruct, rebuild a shattered or war-torn or conflict-riven people group or society? I am not only speaking to the average layperson when I speak of this general lack of knowledge, I am saddened by how the tradition is often misrepresented by people who should know better. And I refer here to ethicists or political philosophers or even political scientists, those who should know. And one cannot even assume, ladies and gentlemen, that the tradition is well known and understood even among military officers across the ranks. As I'm speaking, I'm thinking of an experience I had just several years ago at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where the U.S. Army has its Command and General Staff College. This is a state-of-the-art, it's not a war college, it's a state-of-the-art facility on a very well-known Army post, as they call it, where mid-level officers, and that typically would be majors and lieutenant colonels, are brought together for 11 months of theoretical training. Part of that is ethical training. I think, if I remember correctly, they have 5 tracks, and one of those is ethics. I was invited there to speak on the moral philosophical underpinnings of the just war tradition several years ago. In the question and answer period, I still remember this one major standing up. He was both grateful and, I could tell, frustrated. So after thanking me, he says, "Thank you for this presentation, but," and there was this frustration pent up. And he says, "All well and good. The Army tells us to do good and to be good, but it doesn't tell us how and why." I shall never forget those words. Here the tradition informs us and helps us. A fifth and final assumption behind the book is that every successive generation needs exposure to and reacquaintance, if not initial acquaintance, with the wisdom of the tradition. Several weeks ago, as the volume was just fresh off the press, I had a close family member blurt out to me, "Why are you writing another book on the ethics of war and peace? You've already written several." To which I responded, and I wanted to make sure I quote myself here accurately, Well, the tradition needs to be passed on, and it needs contextualizing. And it needs contextualizing at every level of society. And sadly, I said, most people aren't acquainted with the tradition and its wisdom. And not only that, in another 25 years, there will exist a new level of ignorance. I think I quoted myself correctly. It was something. In any event, these are a few of the assumptions that are behind our book. Before I close, I just wanted to say this. A minute ago, I spoke to the need of learning from the past. Most of us today, regardless of what our lot is, our calling, where we are in terms of our worldview, most of us are we're keenly aware of lessons learned from the recent past, and by that I mean the last 15 years. And here, of course, I'm speaking of Iraq II. One important lesson, for example, as we attempt to put Iraq II in perspective, and hey, today people are every much divided as they were back in 2003. That much is certain. And the lesson is the importance of the third criteria to which I just briefly alluded in passing a minute ago. Dust off your high school Latin. Jus post bellum. What did I just say? No, not may 1,000 fleas from a camel fly into your armpit. That was that. No. Jus post bellum. Justice after conflict. Yes, after war. If there's anything we've learned, it's been that, yes. From the outset, if justice is justice, do we not have the obligation, the moral obligation, to consider what it means to reconstitute a people group, a society, a nation, where just moral justification for intervention has been decided? I say, the tradition, no, I don't say, the tradition says, yes, we do have that obligation. Think Germany after both World Wars. Okay, just personal disclosure here. I mentioned it this afternoon at the State Department. I married into recent German history. My wife is a German citizen. My father-in-law, this dates me, my father-in-law served in the Second World War as a German soldier working for the German railroad. But he did it in Poland. Not only did my father-in-law serve all 5 years of the Second World War as a German soldier working for the German railroad in Poland, his job was a railroad car switcher. Now I ask you, as I've asked myself often, gee, what did Papa see, experience? Now, he never spoke of it in the family and understanding. And by the way, I had the utmost admiration for my father-in-law, so it's not a criticism, it's a reality, which informs me today, and I accept that as a noble and as an honorable cross to bear, if I may use that term, yes. But we are wedded to history. I'll close with a comment about what I understand as a contemporary need to reaffirm this tradition of justified war. Part of the need consists, it seems to me, in frequent misunderstanding and misinterpretation of the tradition by so-called just war theorists. I alluded a couple minutes ago to the literature that really has just exploded since 2003 on just war. Very often, however, these writers approach just war in terms of a checklist. We did that, we did that, we did that, we did that. Okay, push the button. Or perhaps authors tend to speak of just war theory rather than just war doctrine or just war tradition. And here again, we understand, and this is the tradition, not just we, understand the tradition as a river in which one swims. Yes, there are variations, there are inlets, there are lakes, there are coves, but we're joined by a tradition, right? Consider it maybe a moral compass, if you will. But we're joined by a tradition, not a theory. Tradition, we want to understand to be abiding, enduring in its truth value. Some writers also fail to see the interconnectedness of various moral criteria of the tradition. For example, just cause and right intention. Oh, right intention. That means being rightly motivated. That means improper motivations do not justify, such as spreading democracy around the world, national aggrandizement, national honor, territorial expansion. Those are, per Hugo Grotius, unjust intentions. Okay. So it's important to see the criteria as interlocking and united. And some writers perhaps only pitch their tent at last resort, which is a secondary or a prudential qualification. I'm not saying thereby it's unimportant. I'm saying that it's rooted in just cause and proper intention. Last resort. Michael Walzer, properly in his classic Just and Unjust Wars, makes the point very graphically. When do you approach, or when do you arrive at last resort? When does lastness become the last stop? There's always the possibility of doing one more thing, isn't there? Look, police officers and law enforcement officials, they intervene coercively at a reasonable point, don't they? They don't wait until they wait, catastrophe breaks, and then they wait, and then they intervene afterward. No. There is a point morally in which intervention is justifiable, but after reasonable. Yes, all, as Mark emphasized, all non-military, all non-coercive, yes, anything and everything. But at some point, given human nature and given the reality of socio-political evil, coercive force will need to be enacted, will it not? Yes, because of human nature and the reality of socio-political evil. So these are examples of how even writers who occupy themselves with just war perhaps don't understand the tradition. Two final comments. Today we're witnesses to an increase of what humanitarian scholars call complex emergencies around the globe. These are states of dire need that typically require a mixture of military as well as humanitarian intervention. Coercive intervention always needs moral justification, regardless of what and where it is. And an important part of that moral justification comes from the wedding of justice and neighbor love, which has the dignity of human being at its heart. Look, America is not called to police the world. That's not the purpose of our volume. That's not the spirit in which our contributors have written their essays. We are not called to involve ourselves in every global catastrophe, but we are, let me use the word called, for the sake of the common good. The common good is applicable to your neighborhood where you live, neighborhoods that comprise this city, cities that comprise this nation, and nations that comprise a community of nations. We are stewards of the common good, and I would argue from the standpoint of Christian faith, all the more we are stewards of the common good. And I would argue therewith and beyond that, that nations which have much influence, that's, by the way, much greater or lesser influence is not a moral criterion, is it? It's not good, bad, right or wrong. But nations which do have greater influence in the world have greater responsibilities, like it or not. And so it seems to me that the principle of stewardship that is applicable to individuals taught by Jesus and scriptural revelation, to whom much has been given, much will be required, applies also in the community of nations. That nation to which has been given much, of that nation, much will be required. No, we do not make excuses for everything we do or have done in the world, and that's not what the just war tradition does. It does require us to exercise moral discernment and to use our influence justly for the purpose of the common good and affirming human dignity and protecting the oppressed where they have been egregiously oppressed. Thank you very much.
All right, well, we want to bring our portion of this to a close at about 6:45, so I'm going to speak real briefly about the War for American Independence. And I think Daryl might have a word or two about a couple of wars and then we'll turn it over to you. So I'm going to be really brief because time requires it. So I mentioned the contributor to our chapter argued that the War for American Independence was unjust from the perspective of the patriots. He mentioned in passing that it was also unbiblical. And in this, he's in good company. The historians Mark Knoll, Nathan Hatch, George Marston make a similar argument. A few lesser well-known people, Greg Fraser and John Keown, make a similar argument. On the other hand, I have Eric Patterson on my side. He has a nice argument out there that it was just and biblical. Again, a number of you must know Eric Patterson. Let me just briefly sketch some of the issues and suggest how I think about them without pretending that I'm resolving them. They're complicated issues, and good people can disagree. The first argument I'll mention just briefly is, and this didn't play a big role in our Just War book, but as Christians we should be concerned about the Bible, right? Romans 13 seems to say you don't get to rebel. Romans 13:1, let every soul be subject to the higher powers, for there is no power but of God, and the powers that be are ordained of God. Well, the Christian church took this for 1,300 years to mean no rebellion. If the government tells you to bow down and worship Baal, you say no, but you don't get to overthrow it, right? So that's passive resistance. John of Salisbury and a few other Catholic thinkers started fooling around with the doctrine of tyrannicide, but it didn't really go too far, too fast in that era. Then the Protestant Reformation hit. Bam. And almost right away you have Calvin in his Institutes reinterpreting Romans 13. And real quickly the argument goes something like this. If you continue reading Romans 13, you get down to about verse 4, and it says, governments punish those who do evil and reward those who do good. And it doesn't take a great interpretive leap to say, okay, what if we have this entity that calls itself a ruler, and it's routinely punishing those who do good, and it's routinely rewarding those who do evil? That entity would not seem to be the sort of thing that Romans 13 is talking about. And so Calvin and others, John Knox, Pone, Goodman, on and on throughout really the Reformed political tradition, distinguished between a legitimate ruler and a tyrant. And Calvin clearly is on record saying inferior magistrates may properly resist a tyrant. But even as he was making this argument, you had John Knox up in Scotland saying the people themselves may justly resist a tyrant. And this is the way that the tradition developed. Now, you might think that's wrong. You might think that they're wrong. But I think what's important to recognize is that a very large portion of Christians have come to embrace the idea that tyranny may be actively resisted by force. Catholic thinkers eventually got on board, and I think this is probably the mainstream tradition. And so I think at least the America's founders thought they had very good biblical reasons for resisting a tyrannical authority. But this doesn't answer the question. And what our contributor argues and these other scholars argues is, wait a minute, the Americans weren't that oppressed. Yeah, they were taxed, but they were small taxes. They were lightly taxed. They were taxed less than the average English citizen. And those things are all true. But they neglect a very important argument, all right? And that argument is this. According to the patriots, and there are, of course, just like on any constitutional issues, differences of opinion, according to the patriots, the Magna Carta basically means what it says, and I'm paraphrasing, it's written in Latin to begin with, but basically no taxation without representation. All right, no taxation without representation. The problem is not taxation. Virginians are represented in the House of Burgesses. The House of Burgesses may tax Virginians. The citizens of Massachusetts are represented in the General Assembly. They may be in Boston. They may be taxed by the General Assembly. The people in England are taxed by Parliament. Parliament may tax the people of England. What happened with the Sugar Act of 1764, followed by the Stamp Act, followed by a bunch of other ones that I won't go through and list, is for the first time, and this is really the first time ever, Parliament says we're going to tax the American people to raise revenue. And American patriots said, no, you cannot do this. This is outside of your sphere of authority. You don't have the constitutional authority to do this. Now, the taxes weren't heavy, but and people like James Otis admitted it. They said, yeah, it's not heavy, but it's a principle of the thing. Now, here's a way to think about it. Imagine tomorrow the United Nations passed a tax, $1 per American citizen. All right, that's even, we have a few young people out there. Even you guys could pay that tax pretty easily. But would you?
Don't give them any ideas.
Yeah, don't get ideas. I would hope you would not, right? Why not? $1 is no big deal. But the broader principle is the United Nations has absolutely no authority to tax American citizens or citizens of other nations for that matter. Now, do we go to war right away? No. We protest, we say we aren't going to pay, we maybe boycott the UN. There's all sorts of things we can do. But if the UN got its act together in a way that it probably wouldn't, and sent soldiers, blue-helmeted soldiers, into America to seize military stockpiles and this sort of thing, and to eventually get the tax money through military force, I would suggest it would be justified to resist that. It would be self-defense, not offensive warfare, not rebellion. It would be self-defense. This is basically how the argument played out in the American context. There's a lot more to this story, a lot of other things we can mention. I'll just mention one of them because it's for those of you who are parents, you'll appreciate how this is really bad parenting. For those of you who aren't, you should learn this lesson. So Americans did. Remember, beginning 1764, we responded with boycotts. We responded with petitions. We petitioned the king, parliament, the English people. We made arguments, right? Lots and lots of stuff. Now, this economic boycott stuff worked pretty well. And so eventually Parliament repealed a number of the taxes, but Parliament made a huge mistake by issuing the Declaratory Act, 1766. Parliament said, almost literally, okay, we won't tax you this time, but we have the right to do so. And not only that, we have the power to pass legislation in all areas whatsoever. Government without end, without limit. There are no limits to our power. The very definition of tyranny. Now that's probably not what Parliament meant, but they were trying to make a point. All right, again, you could point to other acts, the coercive acts, the denial of trial by jury, the threat of sending a bishop to North America, which, there was a huge debate about this, but basically the fear was that this bishop was going to come to crack down on the 85% of Americans who were dissenters, who were non-Anglicans. The Quebec Act and other things along these lines. So my argument would be that collectively, looking at these various actions of Parliament that were very legitimately viewed as both unconstitutional and just, that on balance, the American patriots were justified in picking up arms and resisting what they considered to be British tyranny. Now, again, let me hasten to say people of good faith can disagree. John Roche disagrees, and that's fine. Some of you may disagree. Let me address real briefly just one other issue, last resort. And this is one thing all the scholars mention. And there is always the argument, well, other things could have been tried. And that's true to a degree, but it's sort of like Daryl with this great analogy of the police officer. This began in 1764. Independence was declared in 1776. That's 12 years. There was a lot of stuff done before really shots were exchanged in 1775. A lot of stuff was done to try to resolve this peacefully. Just to end, let me quote Queen Elizabeth II. She came and gave a speech in Philadelphia in 1976, and she says this: "We lost the American colonies because we lacked that statesmanship to know the right time, the manner of yielding, or what is impossible to keep. But the lesson was learned. In the next century and a half, we kept more closely to the principles of the Magna Carta, which have been the common heritage of both countries." And there's more, but let me just point out, she seems to be acknowledging we violated the principles of the Magna Carta, and we learned a lesson. So sometimes my pacifist colleague mentioned this just the other day when we did this presentation at George Fox. He said, look at the rest of the British Empire. Look at Canada. It managed to achieve independence peacefully. But Queen Elizabeth seems to be saying it was able to do that because the Crown learned a lesson from the American experience. All right, well, we will take questions about that if you want. Daryl, you have about all 6 minutes to come on up and speak about a war or two if you want. Then we'll
Do we have enough time though for Q&A?
Yeah, that'll be 6:45. So just speak about one.
All right, choose one. Yeah, well, often people will ask, gee, what's your number one candidate for the most unjust war in American history? Woo! Yeah, I have two. And I'll bet they're not the two that you chose, that you're thinking of right now. My candidates, the War of 1812 and the War with Mexico, 1846-48. Because Mark is a specialist in the founding I'm not going to deal with 1812, the War of 1812. I'm going to skip and look at the war that was the manifestation of a certain president by the name of, thank you, James K. Polk. Very good. Yes. A largely forgotten war transpiring during the administration of one James K. Polk, who had won a hard-fought election battle of 1844 by campaigning. Do you remember what the promises were? Acquisition of Texas as well as the Oregon Territory. Why is it all but forgotten? Well, obviously, the Mexicans don't enjoy, they don't savor the memory thereof, right? And Americans don't particularly savor it, if for no other reason, because it contradicts this image of our westward migration in covered wagons, peacefully looking for basic human freedoms, yes.
Also known as Manifest Destiny.
Yeah, exactly. And when you fly today into a very busy Los Angeles, named so by Mexican settlers of the 18th century, the reason you fly into one of the busiest U.S. airports rather than a Mexican airport is the Mexican-American War. Polk, let it be remembered, did compromise, as Mark indicated, on the Oregon Territory. So an agreement with Great Britain, Canada got what now is British Columbia, whereas we got Oregon, Washington, what constitutes Idaho, I guess. Is that right? Is that about? Yeah, okay, yeah. Texas, however, posed a little different issue than Oregon. Even when Mexico formally was claiming the province of Texas as part of her republic, Texas really had achieved a level of independence as early as 1836, can we say? In any event, Mexico was in no condition to go to war with the U.S. in the mid-1840s, given the fact that the Mexican government had been bankrupted really by the dictator Santa Anna. But Polk's vision was not merely restricted to Texas. He wanted as well the territory of you've got it. It is at this time, thank you, after Polk had been inaugurated, that this phrase, manifest destiny, begins to appear in public life. And that's not to suggest that all Americans affirmed that sort of vision of American imperialism moving westward. It does, however, mirror the sort of vision that did animate one president by the name of Polk. A vision, by the way, which would be challenged by one Whig congressman from Illinois whose name was
Abraham Lincoln.
In retrospect, then, while it goes really is without saying that America benefited from the territorial gains of the 1840s, it's hard to deny the fact that Polk's decision to invade Mexico was unjust. No legitimate just war benchmarks had been achieved. The goal was none other than territorial expansion. And I close with a quote from the famous Daniel Webster, a prominent Whig and former Secretary of State, who put Polk's insistence on war with Mexico this way, quote, "This whole proceeding is against the spirit of the Constitution and the just limitations of the different departments of the government. It seems to me this extension of executive authority is very dangerous." I think one could agree with the spirit of those words. The war's lessons, though far removed from today, nonetheless remain with us. Hence the value of reflecting on the past.
All right, well now we turn it over to you for
Yes.
questions, objections. Yes, sir.
Could you speak a bit about large-scale civilian casualties, and particularly the decision to drop the atomic bomb?
Yeah. I think just war voices would argue that there has to be unity between ad bellum and in bello considerations. That is, not only must we justify whether or whether not, but how to proceed. What about firebombing? What about some of the outrage of the Second World War? I think you heard, if not said outright, suggested by us that, and I don't think anyone would question that World War II was necessary. Hitler had to. he declared war on us, was it 2 or 3 days after the bombing?
Yeah, somewhere in that
Okay,
ballpark.
yeah. So, in a sense, there was no choice. You know, I asked someone here earlier before the meeting began, should nations have opposed Hitler? But what about in bello considerations? If the tradition, and that's our position, the tradition requires that how justice is executed, that must be in accordance with justice, yeah. We can't just justify it, then bomb the hell out of, or do whatever we want, strafe, firebomb, one thinks of Dresden, not just Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And by the way, the just war tradition has no inbuilt, inherent opposition or antithesis to technology. Okay? Technology is not the issue. It's how technology is used. It's how weaponry is used. That's why people like Paul Ramsey, William V. O'Brien, even the Catholic theologian John Courtney Murray could argue that nuclear technology as a deterrent can be used for just purposes. Now, I'm not assuming we would agree on that. That's my position. You might disagree. But yes, there must be an agreement or a concordance or a unity between ad bellum and in bello considerations. But that doesn't deny the fact that how war and interventionary force have been executed has been often unjust. Now, in the case of World War II, that doesn't deny the fact that the entire enterprise was and can be considered just. No, I don't think any nations would deny the fact that Hitler and Japanese imperialism needed to be restrained and restricted and defeated. Yeah. But having said that, the just war tradition would pitch its tent on this conviction. We don't destroy a people, but we do try to get to the roots. And in that case, it was Nazism, was it not? But we didn't destroy the people, so that look at Germany today. Evidence of the importance of jus post bellum. Yeah.
I was actually going to ask a very related question, although it wasn't. Putting aside the issue of the atomic bomb or firebombing in Tokyo or Dresden or what have you, something that's stuck in my mind is, let's just assume from my point of view anyway, that such as the war in Afghanistan was just, at least in conception. But it did not necessarily, I mean, saying it left behind a just peace is at best problematic. Now Japan, I think you got a pretty good example. Yeah, heck, things went great. You know, within, 20 years it was one of the most powerful countries in the world. We also, killed massive amounts of people. The entire island was starving to death by the time the war was over. Clearly, that was a very high price to pay for a just peace. I guess what I'm asking is, a just peace, at what point you have to consider a just peace at what price? I mean, I think you could make a pretty good argument that, yeah, we can make Afghanistan peaceful, we can go around and, kill half the people in it, or that's an obvious exaggeration, but maybe only just, I mean, how bloody are you willing to go to get a just peace?
Right. Yeah, the just war tradition at its heart is not utilitarian. That is to say, it's not a matter of math. It's just not numbers. Okay. Yeah. Great numbers. I mean, look at just the 2 world wars. Look at the numbers that were sacrificed. But no one whom I've met considers the Second World War and its result unjust. Now, that doesn't mean that every price needed to be paid, but it just does say that sacrifice needs to be made, and it needs to be made through a moral prism. Okay, justice. So, what is justice, and how does that translate? Yeah, and that'll be different with every conflagration, every catastrophe, every crisis, every complex emergency. It'll look different, and so we have to weigh and discern the application of the moral wisdom of the tradition as it applies to that, or that.
Sure.
So there is no, shall we say, formula that fits all catastrophes. Cost, though sad, though tragic, we have to reckon with that reality, but that's why the one in bello criterion of discrimination, non-combatant immunity, is so important. And Gulf War I was, at least on our scene, one of these wonderful, war is not wonderful, but it was, yes, wonderful to see how technology, guided for moral purposes, could in fact limit deaths, destruction. So it could cut both ways, right? That's why the moral guidelines of the tradition are so important. We have to weigh them. Yeah. It's not about blessing what we want to do. Yeah. It's not about numbers. Well, if we go over this number, X thousand, then it is or is not. No, that's not the spirit of the tradition.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
I agree with what you said. I mean, the part, I guess, and I probably should have phrased it differently.
Forgive me, I didn't understand you.
No, you're right, and I think you're making a lot of good points. But to a certain extent, Gulf War I is exactly the problem I'm talking about, insofar as we liberate Kuwait. That's good.
Yes.
But fundamentally, and we paid very little on lives on either side, at least proportionally, compared to other wars. But we left the tyrant in power that continued to, massacre Kurds, continued to do all kinds of bad things. We kind of had a maybe somewhat more just peace, but we left a whole lot of justice on the table for,
Yeah, and I'll add nothing to that. That's what I would say. As well as that went, and as much as just war criteria were honored, we failed in terms of the end result. He should have been removed, which made then too, in the minds of some, necessary. You see, it should have been done, perhaps, as we look back at that time. Yeah.
Let me point out real quickly, our contributor makes an exact point, and we think he's exactly right. And this is where the tradition, even something like Us Post Bellum, can help us think about going into a conflict, right? So we can all agree that it would be wonderful if the tyrant was removed from Syria and Syria became a flourishing liberal democracy. But we have to ask, is that a realistic possibility? Is people in this region at this time, at this place, with their backgrounds and mores, is this a place where you can plant the seeds of a flourishing liberal democracy? And given our experience in other places in the Middle East, I think the answer is almost certainly no. And so even though you might have a tyrant doing bad things, if Daryl and I were asked to counsel a president, which we haven't been, it would say, look, you need to think real hard and carefully about going into this country, particularly if this is your desired outcome, because it ain't going to happen.
Okay, you had your hand up, then this gentleman, and then that gentleman. Go ahead. Yeah, 1, 2, 3.
I want to go back or re-examine. I like some of the points that you made, and I guess I look at the idea of the issues brought up in World War II, and you could probably, if you look across the American wars, the degree of violence again or total warfare conducted basically escalates probably up until World War II, and may have already helped me to answer the question. Is there are limitations to the technology at the time. So for example, Sherman decides, I'm going to end the war, I'm going to make it as painful as possible on my adversaries, which I'm sure they're still pissed off. That
At that time was a brilliant tactic.
well, it was, what the other questions would be, I guess, kind of along the lines of what last resorts. Was there any other way short of killing every man, woman, and child in the rebellious state? So I guess I'm kind of going back. There is no equation, but it sounds like there's a concern of proportionality and there are maxims to be concerned. But when does the execution get to a point where, yes, the outcome was great, the way we did it was not so great. I believe MacArthur contemplated the use of 20 nuclear warheads against the North Koreans to basically put the North Korean war to end. I believe Mr. Truman decided that was probably more likely to predicate the Chinese coming in greater force then, and decided it was time to back off in that conflict and not raise and escalate it to a higher level. I guess what I'm saying is there doesn't seem to be an easy answer, but I guess there's principles to be considered.
Let me make this general observation about every chapter, and it kind of became a little frustrating. So we asked every contributor to address jus in bello considerations. And almost always, not always, but almost always it went something like this. American forces generally conducted themselves in a just fashion. They targeted enemy combatants, even in a case like World War II, where you're trying to bomb a ball bearing factory. They are aiming at the ball bearing factory, but because bombs, these stone bombs were not that precise.
Except maybe for Dresden, where we were.
Yeah. No,
Factories.
but this is where I was going. There is always in each chapter a but. But Dresden, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. But My Lai. But you don't have to have nuclear weapons, right? There were massacres of Indian tribes in the War for American Independence and this sort of thing, right? And so I think Daryl made this point. I think it was publicly, at least he made it before the lecture. There has never been a perfectly just war, and we know that. Justice is something we aim for, we try to achieve, we'll never make it. But I do think one of the lessons of the book is it is the case that a lot of American military forces have been concerned with fighting in a just fashion, with not raping, pillaging, and looting, not destroying civilians, and that oftentimes they've lived up to these standards. And I suppose part of what we hope to do with this volume is, by provoking these sorts of conversations, is maybe, get these ideas out there. And Daryl has had wonderful opportunities to go and teach these principles to military officers who will soon be commanding officers, right? And so I guess we keep working for justice. Daryl mentioned criminal justice. We all know there are all sorts of abuses in the criminal justice system. That doesn't mean we give up on criminal justice, or that we just say to heck with it, right? We try to reform. We try to bring about more justice, even as we recognize if we had the best set of reforms over the next decade, 10 years later, there's still going to be some injustices in the system, but hopefully a lot fewer.
Yes, you were next. Thanks.
So I wanted to critique John Calvin's argument on Romans 13, and just to clarify from the outset, I am not someone who would say that rebelling against tyranny is always unjust, but I want to critique Calvin's specific argument because, Calvin argues the Apostle Paul says government is instituted to reward the good and punish the wicked. Therefore, if government is not doing that, if government is punishing the good and rewarding the wicked, then that is tyranny, and Christians can in good conscience rebel. And I guess my critique of Calvin's argument, point one, all governments do that on some level. I mean, I think most people would consider the American government to be a comparatively just government, and yet I myself, and I would imagine a lot of other people in this room, would say that there are, in terms of many policy issues in the United States today, areas both historically and present day where the United States government is guilty of grave injustices. And then you look at the setting in which Paul wrote Romans 13, this was the Roman government, not exactly a bastion of human rights. And so, I understand what John Calvin's point is, but where do you draw that line? Clearly the Roman government didn't get to that level because Paul wrote this when the Roman government was in power. Where do you draw that line of this government has gotten so evil that we can rebel?
Yeah, could I take this if I may? First of all, there's a lot of literature and a lot of arguments being made to support the right to resist tyrannical authority. I just mentioned one. When Dictae Contras Tyrannos, written a few years later, it's even better. And here's exactly where I think the just war tradition could help us greatly. So yes, America does evil, but we need to think, does America do so much evil, and have we exhausted all the remedies of trying to stop this evil that we're justified in picking up arms and overthrowing the current regime? And secondly, we might ask, is there a reasonable chance that we could succeed in doing so? And I think the answer to both of these questions are no and no. Some people made the argument, certainly Americans held in chattel slavery had just cause to rebel. I'm saying, yeah, they probably did have just cause, but again, they had no reasonable chance of success that would have led to unnecessary death. So that's kind of the way I think we can think of it. In terms of, you're exactly right, Paul certainly wrote this under the Roman Emperor Nero, but again, there are lots of things that might be done, and Paul did some of them, right? I mean, making legal arguments upon appealing to citizenship in some kind of context. But again, there's no chance that the Jewish people or the Christians and Jews or whatever could possibly overthrow this tyrannical government, so rebellion would not be justified.
They eventually did.
Yes, sir.
Let's say next week Kim Jong-un wheels out an intercontinental nuclear warheaded missile. He's fueling it up. What does just war tradition teach us about the possible necessity of a preemptive nuclear strike from the United States.
Okay. No, you. How about you? Yeah, great question. I think about that often, I really do. And I was just commenting earlier today with someone. Yeah, Open Doors, the human rights organization, published in 2018 a watch list. I don't think that's the name of the document, but I think it's something watch list. But at any rate, they rated nations around the world. Of the top 50 oppressors, 38 were Islamic, and of the top 10 oppressors, 9 were Islamic, and number 1, of course, was North Korea. Only to put things in perspective, not to criticize Islam. Yeah. When someone asks me, as an advocate of the tradition and the wisdom of the tradition, why don't we just, I mean, after all, we're saying justice and charity wed together requires that we defend and protect the defenseless, right? Yeah. Where there's gross oppression. It's the darkest place on the face of the earth. We know that from defectors. And I think we can sense that it's a tyranny. My own view, and again, I'm not speaking for the tradition or speaking for Mark, we didn't address that. We did address the Korean War, but not contemporary North Korea. What do we do today, as you're asking? My own position is that as it is right now, as it has stood since the end of the Korean War, it would be unwise to intervene there simply because it would so destabilize the globe, not just that part of Asia, but the globe, that the costs, whatever they are, would be so far beyond anything we can calculate. But that doesn't let us off the hook. You know, and as a confessional Christian, I say, and I'm enheartened by Christian watch organizations that are really trying to document and cause people to intercede on behalf of the Korean church and intercede on behalf of this regime. But I also think that there are things in this natural world which diplomats, military strategists, politicians, policy analysts can do in addition to an informed citizenry. And then we trust in the end the providence of God, don't we? No. So what could be done? I said what I don't think would be wise, prudential, up to this point. Now you have just said next week it changes. And then I'd have to say next week something different than what I said about this week or last year or 10 years ago. At that point then, yes, the tradition I think requires us to address injustice for the common good, for the protection of others, not just North Koreans, certainly North Koreans, but other nations, other people groups, for the well-being of the world. That's why we can't put too much stock in the United Nations. I'm not opposed to the United Nations, but again and again, the United Nations has been shown, first of all, they're not peacemaking, they're peacekeeping. So those blue hats will not protect. They will not prevent tyranny, outrage. Now they came into Rwanda 25 years ago after anywhere between 800,000 and 1.25 million. The estimates are still just that, as it's unknown. But in the following decade, that cancer spread into other nations surrounding. So yes, we must, it seems to me. We must react. I can't tell you, great question, I can't tell you here's exactly what we must do. But hypothetically and generally, I would say, yes, if things change next week, then yes, the tradition, I think, counsels us to resist socio-political evil for the common good, for the sake of humanity, and justice, and yeah, the universal characteristics. The moral fiber of justice must guide us, and that's going to look different in different geopolitical scenarios, and we have to weigh that. But I don't believe that we don't have a source of moral wisdom, even to help us with that conundrum. Yeah. As difficult as it is, as awful, as oppressive as it is. Yeah. But that's how I view North Korea up to this point. Next week, if that happens, then I don't change my mind, but I think I changed my strategy. Still invoking the tradition, but maybe with a different inflection. Over here, and then back there. And then, or ma'am, did you have your hand up for a while?
Not really.
Okay, so Mark, right?
Yes,
And then over here, and then back there, yeah.
All right. Well, Mark, it's good to meet you. I haven't met you before, and Daryl, we've met, and I've
Right.
worked with you.
And it's
all.
not good to meet me.
It is so great to meet you. Or
I'm
to
not
see you.
hurt.
Yes. So right now I'm reading through Patterson's American Just Wars in order to do a podcast interview with him next week, hopefully, about that. And so a couple of questions. One, like you mentioned, War of 1812 is one of your two, and he has a chapter defending the War of 1812.
Oh. Well.
So, what would, like, I'm not sure, like, how would you compare your book to his, if you're familiar with and read it? If not, then that's okay. And, like, what question would you want me to ask him?
Yeah.
about
Well,
it?
first of all, let me just put all my cards on the table. I do not like Eric. I just do. No, I'm I say that because I really do like him, and we're engaged in a book project right now coming up. Yeah, we're going to be looking at the Just War tradition as it's refracted through various Christian denominations over their history.
Interesting.
Wow. So we'll see. Yeah. But why? Look, and I could be wrong, but here's my read, and I want Mark to speak to this and to correct me if I am. But look, the colonies and Britain were bumping along since the War for Independence. Madison inherited something, that was going on in Jefferson's day. He was his Secretary of State. And and there were two issues, as I recall, that were important. Britain stopping all these seafarers to find...
To grab American citizens on the high seas.
Yeah, or British soldiers who were AWOL.
Which was, they're, right.
Yeah, and trade, right?
Yes.
There was Britain's no trade with Napoleon's France, right?
France is no trading with Britain.
So those are important, but I don't see, as I recall, the Congress is divided. Madison anyway wanted to go to war, and then, if I have my facts correct, Britain changed its official policy and sent news to the American shore, but by the time it reached the American shore, Madison had already decided to on conflict at the Canadian border. And even after news arrived, if I have it right, he didn't change his mind. So we were not being attacked. It was not self-defense. And I would say diplomacy, good, hard diplomacy should have been applied. Now that's my short, rough answer. And Eric may just kind of put me to shame, and I'm asking Mark to throw light on that as a non-historian.
Let me just add real quickly, Jonathan Den Hartog, a very fine historian, wrote that chapter and makes the same argument that Daryl made. He thinks it's clearly an unjust war we should not have entered. Let me just add two things to what Daryl said. First of all, I think in America, we sometimes would grant citizenship willy-nilly. So you actually would have a British sailor who would make it to America and would say, okay, you're an American. But Great Britain didn't see it that way. They said, no, you're still a Britishman. So some of these so-called Americans that were being seized were actually, as you pointed out, British deserters or British citizens and this sort of thing. And as Daryl said, but just to put a point on it, England said eventually, okay, we'll stop doing that. We will not do that anymore. And they said word. And really it was an offense of honor. America's honor had been questioned.
Yeah.
And so we went to war to defend our honor. We were not under attack. Great Britain did not want to go to war with us. They had no interest in that. It was an unnecessary war that was catastrophic in many ways. Den Hartog points out the one great victory on the American side is down in New Orleans. It occurred several weeks after the war was over. But this is one reason we tend to have fond memories of the war. To the extent, it's like kind of an American victory, but it was an unnecessary war that led to a lot of unnecessary suffering.
Yeah. Do you agree with Jonathan on that?
I think so. Yeah. I have, like you, a great deal of respect for Eric Patterson's. I'd like to see his argument.
Yeah.
And
And I haven't read it.
So can we change our anthem? Can we change it?
Let's see, back here and then to that lady. Thank you.
So I'm a native Texan, and I also just lived in Korea for 3 years. So I'm tempted by a number of tangents, but I'm not going to go there. I'm going to ask instead ask about counter arguments and whether your book, how it addresses Anabaptist pacifism or maybe other arguments. And if it doesn't, which is understandable if you're writing for a just war tradition, but where should one go to get the best reading, strongest one that gives you the most pause, or who do we need to read on the pacifist side to balance this out and understand it better?
Your question is, who represents most forcefully the pacifist tradition, or?
I guess maybe what, just your recommendation for someone new to this area. We want to get your book, but we also want to, wonder what's on the other side, wonder what other Christian traditions think.
Yeah.
Where would you send us? What pacifist thinkers or others give you the most pause?
Right.
They have a point here, or
Okay.
at least it's potentially strong.
Shall I? Do you want, or shall we?
yeah, go ahead if you'd like.
Yeah, I don't like, but I'll go ahead. Now, I'm going to make a qualification here. This is going to sound like a criticism, but it's meant as an observation. There's a tendency among pacifists to want their cake and have their cake.
And eat it too.
And eat it too.
And eat it too.
Want their cake and eat it too. Okay, yeah.
We want justice,
What-
but not the bloodshed together.
Okay. What do I mean by that?
Anyone think?
Let me. Somebody brought up at the State Department the category of a nuclear pacifist. That is, a person who would be open to coercive force, but given the destructive technology and the nature of weapons today, it's impossible to have a just war. Wait a minute. And then when this has been my experience. I don't know what Mark's has been, and I don't know what you all have experienced, but I've never met such a, let's call this person a nuclear pacifist. I have a friend who somewhat cynically calls them crypto pacifists, but that's maybe a little unkind. Nuclear pacifist. I've never met a nuclear pacifist who ever could identify a war that he or she would engage in or consider just.
Yeah.
Now, isn't that interesting? Now, that's the cynic in me coming out, and I need to be slapped. I grew up, I think, did you mention that at the beginning?
Briefly.
I grew up in an Anabaptist tradition. I grew up in a Mennonite home. I grew up in a confessionally, ideologically pacifist tradition. Anabaptists, of course, are part of the Protestant Reformation, early 16th century. They're considered part of the Radical Reformation. And on these points, these matters of use of coercive force, use of the sword, Christians' permissibility to do either or become a ruler, a no-no. So the earliest Anabaptist document, the Schleitheim Confession of 1527, laid out 7 articles, Schleitheim Confession. The earliest Anabaptists came out of Zwingli. They came out of the Zurich Reformation, Ulrich Zwingli. And you have several people who are disciples of Zwingli, but then quickly reject his acquiescence to an affirmation of the secular authorities. And an Anabaptist, then, of which the Mennonites today probably are the largest group, okay. And where I grew up in Pennsylvania, there are many. They're also congregated in Ohio, right, in Kansas, and other parts of the Midwest and East, and there are probably some in Maryland too, I don't know. But yeah, Anabaptists today hold to this very strict notion of separatism. Separatism was absolutist in the Schleitheim Confession. Every article of the 7 emphasized separatism. And the largest, the longest, the most lengthy article was on the sword. I think that's article number 6. But for them, separatism was based on the antithesis, the opposition between the kingdom of this world and the kingdom of Christ. We are of the kingdom of Christ. This is the kingdom of the world. And anything that reminded them of the world was to be eschewed, rejected. Yes? So, first and foremost, of course, the sword and political authority, because these were the instruments used guess what? Against them from the beginning. Hey, the early 16th century, and it wasn't confined just to a decade or two, this was not an era of religious freedom. Dissenting views of what the church taught were considered heretical, and heresy was often met with a death penalty. And so many of the early Anabaptist leaders either died by the sword or they were burnt at the stake, and their wives were uniformly drowned as co-conspirators. That was the pattern in the early to mid 16th century. So there is this. So you can see the Anabaptists in their origin are persecuted from both Catholic and fellow Protestant sides. The magisterial reformers write a lot in reaction to the Anabaptists. Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, Bucer, Melanchthon, even Philip, who was fairly mellow and was not the fighter that Luther was, had real concerns about the Anabaptists, because the perception was, whether this is true or not is not my statement or my argument, the perception was that they were against the social order by their refusal not only to bear the sword, but to take the oath, which in the late medieval period would have been a sign of loyalty in the community. And so if you don't take the oath, and by the way, that was one of the 7 articles, denying the validity of the oath. If you didn't take the oath, you were not a good citizen. You were disloyal. You were a heretic. Or in our days, you are a terrorist, an anarchist. So this greatly disturbed the magisterial Protestant reformers. So you have them writing on issues of justice and affirming, in most of their cases, the secular authorities. Not just because of their reading of St. Paul in Romans 13, but because of what was going on in terms of peasant revolts, which were being fueled, strangely, by Lutheran teaching, gotten a hold of by people like Thomas Müntze and other radicals who decided, let's bring in the New Jerusalem, let's do it on our own. And a particular reading of the Revelation, the Apocalypse, confirms that they need to take the sword in their hand. Well, you have Mennonites and other Anabaptists reacting and seeing this tragedy of radical Anabaptism using the sword, and so that all the more confirms their pacifist and their separatist tendency. We must be peace-loving in any context at all costs. And today, Anabaptists, when I visit my relatives on my dad's side of the family in Pennsylvania, I love them to death. They have this wonderful social ethic. When there are natural disasters or catastrophes, they're the first to help. But today, as much as in the 16th century, they are against coercive force. You would never find a Mennonite serving in the military. You would never find a Mennonite serving as a security guard or a policeman or a law enforcement officer. Not only that, today you do not find Mennonites, and I'm just speaking of my own, I'm not a Mennonite anymore, but this is my tradition. You would not find them as lawyers, economists, politicians, policy analysts. Why? Because of their perception that this is compromise with the world. Remember, separatism between the kingdom of Christ and the kingdom of this world.
That was a very long and eloquent answer. Let me answer a little bit more directly, and then we'll get to her. We do address pacifism in the introduction briefly. We point Yoder and Hauerwas are 2 very prominent contemporary advocates of this position. We just couldn't do everything in this volume, and we were asked to do some wild things. One of the first reviewers said, "Oh, you should include a chapter in the Islamic tradition of just war and the Chinese tradition." No, I mean, it's a fine thing to study, but we can't do everything in this volume. So we do address these things, but it's pretty briefly, but we do point you towards literature. Yes, ma'am, you've been very patient.
I have 2 points, and the first is by far the most important, which is that the best novel that talks about the War of 1812 is Patrick O'Brien's The Fortunes of War, or the Aubrey Maturin series. So it's from the British point of view. It's amazing. So you guys actually have to read that. That is my main point. My secondary point has to do with, so Dr. Paul, you were talking about, you sort of contrasted a flourishing liberal democracy with tyranny. And in the way that we understand the argument in favor of the American Revolution now, I think tends to be something like no taxation without representation, which means that we are where we don't consent to government. Like, if we don't have, we have a right to self-government. And if there's not a mechanism, or if that mechanism isn't active, we are by definition being tyrannized against, and therefore we would have the right to rebellion. As I understand it, that's not actually part of the tradition. And so is that correct? And so do you find yourself like making, it's a really strange kind of an argument to make in contemporary America, like, no, if you don't consent to government, no wrong is being done to you. But was that addressed in the chapter? Is that something that you find yourself engaging with?
Yeah, let me do qualify this for sure. So I think human flourishing is what we're concerned with. I think the Bible's agnostic on political orders and economic orders and that sort of thing. So there could be just monarchies, just mercantilist systems, just governments where you have no consent whatsoever, period. Someone just gets to be king because he comes out of a particular person's womb. So yeah, to just lay that out there. I think the argument is in a particular constitutional context, if people are violating constitutional norms, if they're acting in such a way as to threaten human flourishing, we would be justified, conceivably people are justified in offering active resistance to that. So let me just shift the example. Let's say that tomorrow Donald Trump declares himself dictator for life, imprisons all of Congress, imprisons the Supreme Court, and orders America's military into the streets to I don't know, throw out all the Hispanic Americans and oppress all the women, or whatever else, right? I think we would justly have a right to resist that actively, and hopefully, of course, that resistance would come first from the military, second from inferior magistrates, state governments, and other things. But it's not necessarily because we have a right, a God-given right to a constitutional order that has a 4-year executive and a 2-year. It's just this order we have.
Yeah.
And so we could justly complain about violations of this constitutional order, particularly violations that seem likely to lead to tyranny and to the detriment of human flourishing.
I think this needs to be the final question.
Is
Final
it Faith?
question.
Is it Faith back there? Is that your name, Faith?
Thank you,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. Okay.
You can take this to be hypothetical if you want to, but this situation, I want to know how just war tradition would deal with an idea that a nation that believes it does have a just cause of defending itself against, say, rebel forces that are trying to take over the government, and an influential country like ours intervenes in a way that actually perpetuates the war for years, other than it could have been stopped immediately. What do you say about that?
Are you thinking of Venezuela?
Pardon?
Are you thinking of Venezuela?
No, I'm thinking of South Sudan.
Oh,
right
I see.
now.
I see.
I mean,
Wow. My, that's a mess, isn't it? Because South Sudan has not become what we were hoping it would become not that many years ago, where they were oppressed by Khartoum.
right.
And here, what's his name, Bashir, is out in the north. You know, I mean,
Things still aren't so good in the north.
no.
Yeah.
So, I don't know what to make of that mess.
Well, if the U.S. had not given moral equivalence to the rebels, though, and allowed South Sudan to stop the war, it wouldn't have continued. So wouldn't that be more of a just war situation than allowing the war to keep going and going, because we think that you should make both sides morally equivalent, even though one side is a sovereign government?
Well, if there had been intervention, then you have this domino effect kind of turn on its head, you know. Does that so destabilize the entire Middle East? And that's, so just war moral reasoning requires that we think about these. That's a part of the cost too, the repercussions in the world by our intervention, not just solely the plight of the suffering people, as much as that's important. Yeah, that has to be at the heart of it, but there are prudential considerations too. And it could be that geopolitically intervention may have, and again, I'm not speaking with any authority, but I think those are questions that have to be raised. Would our intervention have such debilitating effects geopolitically in a region of the world or globally that that's part of the cost?
Well, I think we did. I mean, our intervention was the wrong direction. We didn't need to intervene at all. I'm saying we should have let them do what they wanted to do and not say, you know, you can't fight, or, you know, and accuse the government of genocide when they were trying to just defend their sovereignty. So anyway, sorry.
Let me just say briefly, we haven't discussed this, and I know nothing, I know more than the average bear, but I don't know enough to comment about that situation specifically. It is a kind of a concern of ours that it might be a little misleading for focusing on America's major wars. I mentioned one concern, not looking at wars that were not fought, but it is my sense in this era since 9/11 that the U.S. military is way too active in way too many places and using violence from afar in ways that are counterproductive. And so we really, we wanted to have a chapter on this sort of thing, and maybe we'd even need multiple chapters. I think the just war tradition, it is really, it's a high burden. It's a really high bar to meet before you start killing people. And so I can't speak about that specific situation or many, many other situations. But again, if anyone would listen to me, I would say, look, before we intervene militarily, there's a really high bar to meet, and have you met it here?
Yeah, I'm going to make one more comment, and it goes back to the question about resources that you had asked. Yeah, and I'm so glad Mark mentioned something. Yeah, when you read John Howard Yoder and Stanley Hauerwas, they're not the only ones, but they've been the more visible proponents of a pacifist tradition. Yoder is not living anymore, Hauerwas is, but they are unflinching. That's why they're at least good to read. They're unflinching. Whereas there are a lot of pacifists who, if they're not nuclear pacifists, they hedge because they don't want to be perceived as separatists. I had one such experience a couple weeks ago. I was speaking at a university in South Florida as part of a colloquium, and on the panel was a woman who teaches at a Mennonite seminary. Now, there's no such thing as a Mennonite seminary professor who's not a pacifist. But so I was trying throughout the day in several sessions to clarify what the basic operating assumptions of pacifist ideology and just war thinking and a militaristic or political realist scheme would be. She got so frustrated with me, and in between one of the sessions just chewed me out and said, "Do you realize what you're doing? You are," and I can't remember what I said exactly, but she was so provoked that I was trying to clarify. Now, I didn't accuse her of obscuring or blurring the lines between pacifist assumptions and just war assumptions, but there is this tendency to try to interpret what just war idea is by pacifists, and they really are starting from pacifist principles of nonviolence. And as I illustrated before, it's very hard to get these people to identify at least one war that is justifiable when you pin them against. So at the end of the night, after the last session, I turned to her and I said, "Sister, I've never met a Mennonite seminary professor who's not a pacifist. You would be the first. Are you a pacifist?" And she just refused to answer. And now, I don't say that to criticize her. I say that to illustrate her desire to come across to the audience throughout the day as being relevant, activist, politically engaged, and not separatist. Okay, recall the separatism, which is an effect, a symptom of a view of the powers and our place in culture. And it's not just Anabaptists who are separatists on this. I think there's a tendency among any Christians today to become separatist. They might just grow disenchanted with political discourse and say, I see this among students. The tendency is to opt out and not participate with guts in the public square. to which the tradition says, no, no, and no. We must participate, even when we have our disagreements. Yeah. So I say that by way of illustration. I'm sorry.
That's our last question.
Okay. All right.
They